For having me here. It's a pleasure to be on the Heroic Network with you for sure.
Give us the quick kind of hero's journey of your background, how you found yourself in the coaching space, what that journey has been like, and some of the highlights that you've experienced in the process.
So I all started back in my university days. Well, maybe even before that, I was an athlete my entire life. Loved it. It was my number one thing to do. I played for my university team and eventually went on to play professionally. And a little later on in life, I did a lot of coaching from the beginning. I was always very passionate about, excelling in my sport. So I wanted to pass that on to the people that I was coaching. And so I was always very keen to find like the latest kind of mental approach or technique or the latest research to kind of help my athletes and myself kind of, excel and reach the top. And life was going great, as your typical type A, moving along. And as I got in my early 40s, I was still like pretty competitive, playing pretty high level of ultimate frisbee, another kind of fringe sport, and still playing a little squash here and there. And then life kind of like smacked me. I wasn't really expecting it. It was completely out of the blue to say I wasn't really expecting it. I wasn't really expecting it at all. And unfortunately, I found myself in a terrible situation where I nearly died. Found myself in ICU for several days, inexplicable out of nowhere. Just to give a little more backstory, a couple of weeks before I was at the track doing 400-meter sprints or 100-meter sprints, feeling great, fit, still pushing the envelope as much as I could in my early 40s. Then I was off coaching some junior athletes at a national event, and I started a fast. And during that fast, I'd done fast several times in the past, and I always felt like they were just, something good to do for your body, something that was a good mental reset, a good discipline. And about halfway through that, I felt like unusually bad. Like you don't feel great when you're fasting, but this was like something wasn't right. So I kind of woke up shaky, really exceptionally weak, could barely move my arms and legs. And that led to a series of events where I was hospitalized, in ICU. I thought I was never going to see my family again. And then eventually sent home with not a lot of information other than the doctors had identified that I had very dangerously low phosphate. It was actually so low, the emergency doctor said he'd never seen it so low in anybody in his 10 or 20 years in the emergency ward. Like they identified it, but they didn't really have any solutions. So they sent me home. And, instead of that being the end of it, it was kind of the beginning of like a long and arduous road that at times I thought I would never make it through. So crawling up the staircase to get to my bedroom, needing to rest for, panting at the top of that staircase for like 20 minutes, lying on my side, so weak that I couldn't come downstairs for my son's 3-year birthday. And spent basically just under 5 months in bed 22 hours a day. And that led to the next 8 years of recovering, where I couldn't really lift my heart rate above a resting heart rate without risk of respiratory or cardiovascular failure. So I wasn't sure if I'd be able to make a living, pay my bills, support my family, ever work again, ever exercise again. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to get out of bed again. It was just terrifying. And through that process of it being, such a setback in my life, I had to go through a grieving period, just for everything that I had lost, in my life. And, you're depressed, you're discouraged, you're at your wit's end. You don't know what to do to kind of get out of it. So, you have to go through that grieving process. And once I got through that, that takes some time, and there's elements of both grieving and trying to solve your problem. So my problem was that there weren't really any solutions coming from the medical industry. So I had to kind of stop and take responsibility for what was going on and decide that I've got to do something about this. So that was really the switch. So going from just being incapacitated to like, okay, I've got to start walking out of this hole. And so that's where I drew on sort of an athlete's mindset of like, I've got to take a daily, step-by-step approach and do a little bit of not training, because obviously I was nowhere near that, but taking steps to find some constructive solutions and actions that I could take to help myself walk out of that dark cave and back into a more functional life. And my first goal, so, like having little steps and then little goals and not looking ahead and not looking back was really key for me. And my first goal was to get back to a full day of work. And to give you an idea of how slow and how much I failed in this process, I got back to an hour and a half a day after nearly 5 months, and then 2 hours a day, and then 3 hours a day, and 4 hours a day. And then by the 1.5 year mark, I got back to 7 hours a day. And fortunately, I worked for a place that was very patient with me through that process. But it was that was my system and my process for crawling out of the hole that I had found myself in. And, so using small steps, having that kind of vision of where I wanted to get to at the end of the day, and taking it day by day were really critical. Not thinking, if I spent any time thinking about like what I had and where I was and how great my life was to where I was, it was a recipe to feel even more depressed. And I went through depression. I write about it in my book, like I cried basically every day for the first 4 months because it was so devastating what I was going through. But I learned that I had to kind of stay focused in the present moment and look forward to what I was trying to accomplish, and then work every day towards achieving those goals. So there's a few different things in there, but hopefully you plucked out a couple as we went along. The book that I wrote, A High Performing Mind, wouldn't have been written the way it is today without, of course, that experience. So I love how you say the hero's journey. I am familiar with that. A friend of mine works in that space, and I think it's a really incredible way to kind of frame life. So, yeah.